Bishop Heber says that Ghazipur was celebrated throughout India for the wholesomeness of its air and the beauty and extent of its rose gardens. With time, the East India Company succeeded in replacing the rose gardens nearly completely with opium fields. It was the great proconsul Warren Hastings who first imposed a state monopoly on the production and sale of opium in 1772. The sheer scale of the trade was breathtaking. By 1828, about 80,000 acres in eastern India were growing opium. But the role of opium in East India Company revenues has probably been exaggerated. Between 1834 to 1839, it only accounted for 6% of the total Indian government official revenues. Even at its peak in 1880, opium only accounted for 14% of British revenues in India. Nevertheless, it played a very important role in maintaining a balance of payment situation with China because Chinese tea was a major British import. Ghazipur remains a busy market town, one that is perhaps hard to like because of very narrow and poorly maintained streets and large crowds, but with clear signs of prosperity. Not much remains of older architecture or older buildings in Ghazipur. Bishop Heber was very impressed by the large, handsome palace on the eastern aspect of the town, one that was very familiar to British painters. Bishop Heber gives a detailed description of this palace and he sketched the gateway to the palace complex itself. Wandering through the streets in Ghazipur, I find this gateway. Still there, still preserved, although heavily encroached. Ghazipur is also famous because of a chance association with Lord Cornwallis. Cornwallis was the British general who had lost the American War of Independence. The surrender of Cornwallis at Yorktown is considered a pivotal moment in the founding of the United States, so much so that this painting is one of six in the US Capitol Rotunda. Cornwallis himself was not present at the surrender, copped out citing illness, and sent his second in command. That is why the person accepting his surrender is not Washington, who is in the background on a black horse. The defeated Lord Cornwallis then managed to secure a posting in India as Governor General between 1784 to 1792. His term was hailed for defeating Tipu Sultan. This painting shows Cornwallis taking Tipu Sultan's two sons as hostages. This man of honor would stoop to anything. Cornwallis was sent to India for his second term as Governor General in 1805. He was sent to undo the legacy of the Wellesley brothers, but he died shortly after arrival in India. He was 67. He was buried here in Ghazipur because he felt like a tree should be let where it fell. This stunning painting by Sitaram shows the cantonment at Ghazipur with its thatched roof bungalows and shows the construction of the tomb of Cornwallis in the distance. It is late in the evening when I visit Cornwallis's tomb in Ghazipur. The sandstone monument is glowing in the dusk, and this entire area has been lovingly maintained. But the bishop, this mean architectural critic, calls this building utterly unmeaning, neither a temple nor a tomb, in fact, a folly. He notices that the pillars, instead of beautiful Corinthian, are the meanest Doric and too slender for their height. He did not see a statue here. I thank my stars. I have found a friendly guard. He agrees to take me to the tomb itself and open the tomb chamber. Inside, I see a remarkable monument to a man who fought on three continents, ruled in two, and died in harness. One side depicts a Hindu and a Muslim in an attitude of mourning. On the other side is a native and British soldier of the East India Company. On one side is an inscription in English, and on the other is an inscription in Persian. A sacred city for Hindus for many millennia, Bishop Heber expected to see a crowded place, but what surprised him was the wealth and industry that he saw. The bazaars were full of richness and beauty. Benaras was the mart where traders brought shawls from the north, diamonds from the south, muslins from the east, and it had considerable silk, cotton, and woolen factories of its own. In addition to being the richest and the most populous city in India, Benares was also most likely the safest place in the country. This was because of the unique system of the policemen, so called chaprasis, that were selected by the inhabitants themselves. The city was divided into 60 wards, each of which had a gate that would shut down at night. Robberies and murder were exceedingly rare. Bishop Heber's first destination in the city of Benares, as it is for millions today, was the Kashi Vishwanath Mandir, one of the most sacred sites in all of India. This has also been a flashpoint for Hindu Muslim riots for centuries. It has now been completely reconstructed on the outside and is like a fortress. Photography is strictly prohibited inside. Next door is the Annapurna Mandir, which Bishop Heber and James Prinsep thought was identical to Anna Perenna of Roman mythology. In this temple, Bishop Heber describes a Brahmin who spent his entire day sitting on a little pulpit. Thanks to James Prinsep, we have a sketch of this Brahmin seated on a singhasan. This Brahmin was well versed in the Vedas and the Shastras and spent his entire day reading or lecturing on the Vedas. I go looking for the place where this Brahmin must have preached and studied, and it has to be this corner, slightly modified since the time. Walking through Benares today, as Bishop Heber noticed 200 years ago, the walls are all covered in paintings, mostly of gods in their many formed, many headed, many handed, and many weaponed varieties. The streets of Varanasi are just as crowded in the morning as they were late at night. I take a ride to the river, to the ghat, hoping to catch a boat. The city forms a natural amphitheater and is best seen from the river. Next to the ghat is the palace of Mansingh, the Rajput general of Emperor Akbar. With its ornate windows carved in the Rajput style, this is a famous landmark of Benares. On this ghat, a boat was waiting for Bishop Heber and his party. He then had an opportunity of seeing the city on its most favorable side, and he notices that it's a very large place and rises from the river in an amphitheatrical form, thickly studded with domes and minarets, and with many fine ghats descending to the water's edge, all crowded with bathers and worshippers. That has not changed. Many of the ghats here in Benares have been built by rulers from all over India as a demonstration of their piety. The Raja Ghat was built by Amrit Rao, at one point the candidate for Peshwa or minister of the Maratha Empire. He settled with the British and was put to exile in Benares, where he became renowned for his generosity and at one point freed all the debtors in Benares. Amrit Rao died at the time of arrival of Bishop Heber to Benares. The one Raja that the bishop did meet was the Raja of Benares, Raja Udit Narayan Singh, who called on him in Sikroli. The fact that the Raja calls on the bishop tells us how far local Hindu rulers had fallen. Udit Narayan was the son of Mahib Narayan, who was placed on the throne by the British after the removal of his uncle Chet Singh by the ravenous Warren Hastings. Bishop Heber describes Udit Narayan Singh as corpulent with a lot of color in his cheeks. Unknown to Bishop Heber, Udit Narayan was really quite accomplished. More than anyone else, the mastermind behind the resurgence of the Ram Leela and making it the spectacular show it remains to this day. Udit Narayan told Bishop Heber that the name of the city came from the two rivers which flow into the Ganga here. Obvious misinterpretations aside, this is clearly the origin of Varanasi, the name of the city, after the rivers Varuna and Asi. Mark Twain famously said that Benares is older than history, older than tradition, older than even legend, and looks twice as old as all of them put together. That said, Benares has been constantly remade and recast and even reimagined, most recently by the ambitious Kashi Vishwanath project. Out here in Benares, the bishop met a remarkable man, James Princep. He was a metallurgist and came here as the mint master. James Prinsep was a polymath, one of many such individuals that worked for East India Company. He did some path-breaking work in metallurgy, was interested in architecture, did many significant engineering works around Benares, including draining marshes, building bazaars, building bridges. He is best known for deciphering the Brahmi script, which let us understand Ashokan inscriptions. This brilliant young man died at 40, early, like many East India Company officials. He also carried out a census of Benares in 1828, which gave a population of 181,000. In his lifetime, he published lithographs of Benares, which give us a very good idea of what the city looked like when the bishop visited. Even as I admire James Prinsep and his remarkable genius, it is important to keep in mind that the source of his family's fortune was his father's indigo business. Look deep enough, and you will almost always find something dark in the heart of everything connected with the East India Company. The bishop's account of Benares, while rich in historical and spiritual details, overlooks one important cultural aspect of this city. This was also an entertainment center. With his typical precision, James Prinsep documents that in 1824 there were 264 Hindu and 500 Muslim Nachkals in Benares. James Prinsep talks about the fairy forms and melodious voices of the Nachkals, which are wont to breathe seductive raptures amid the exhilarating gambols of the holy festival. James Prinsep also sketched the Nachkals and the musicians, but it's very difficult in these black and white pictures to appreciate how incredible these women looked in their costumes and how incredibly skilled they were as dancers and musicians. Long a landmark of Benares, the Alamgir Masjid has now lost its lofty minarets. The Alamgir Mosque stands today as a poignant testament to the complex political history of India. It was built by Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb in the 17th century at the site of a demolished Hindu temple. This act, along with the demolition of many other Hindu temples in Benares, were seen as deliberate acts of provocation and laid the groundwork for future Hindu Muslim conflicts. But the mosque itself is a remarkable example of Mughal architecture, and its design, a blend of Islamic and Hindu elements, reflecting the syncretic nature of Indian culture. The minarets themselves were unusually slender, only about 8.25 feet in diameter at the base, climbing to a height of 147 feet. Repaired by James Prinsep, but eventually were demolished in the 1930s because they were unsafe. The alleyways in Benares are narrow and crowded just as they were 200 years ago. In fact, they were so narrow that Bishop Heber found it hard going even in a tanjan, a sort of a chair lifted by several people in this crowd. But there are paintings everywhere which make up for these small alleyways and some remnants of what must have been magnificent architecture in its time. The paintings are everywhere and they are overwhelming. Out in this tiny alleyway is the Jain temple that Bishop Heber visited. This must have been a brand new temple at the time. Inside, I see the date of establishment was January-February of 1814 when translated into a Western calendar. The ornate doorway has a carving that depicts a lioness and cow eating from the same bowl and suckling their young.
कभी आइए तो आपके साथ सत्संग हम करें, आपका स्वभाव से हम भी बहुत अभिभूत हैं।
I pass by Kashi Vishwanath temple. In daylight, this looks even more like a fortress with its imposing gateway. The wall art in Benaras is something else. Now run down and stuck in litigation, this was the site of the mission school when Bishop Heber visited. Established and endowed by Jainaran and Ghoshal from a rich family in Kolkata. This was established at the time of the visit of the Marquess of Hastings. Bishop Heber saw about 140 Brahmin boys being educated here. They were taught Urdu and Persian in addition to English and arithmetic. Bishop Heber observed very astutely that some of these boys might grow up to be accomplished hypocrites, something that is pretty obvious to anyone today. Near the school, Bishop Heber visited the Haveli of Devki Nandan, which is this very Haveli. He met with the children of Devki Nandan. He was very impressed by the Haveli and likens it to a Venetian palace and the doorway to the gate of Christ Church in Oxford. He was really impressed by the inside of this Haveli that I do not have an opportunity to see. But what I find most striking is his description of the artwork that he saw. He saw a painting of Sterne and Maria, a popular romance from that era, another of Goethe's Book of Sorrows of Werther. There was also a print made by Shivlal, a miniaturist from Patna, and most importantly, he saw a painting of Emperor Akbar Shah II, the Mughal emperor who ruled in faraway Delhi at the time. The Sanskrit school now A Sanskrit university was established by John Duncan, a man held in the highest esteem by people around here. To be called Duncan Saab Ka Bhai was the highest compliment one could receive from a Banarasi. This has one of the most astonishing Gothic buildings of later construction I have seen anywhere in India. When the bishop visited, students here were taught reading, writing, and arithmetic, as well as Sanskrit and Persian, Hindu law and scriptures, astronomy, and astrology. Bishop Heber felt very strongly that this whole Indian system, taught in an establishment funded by the government, was rubbish. And here you can see clearly the transition occurring from Warren Hastings' school of thought, where Indian systems of education were respected, to Macaulayism, where everything Indian was derided and ridiculed. In the words of Macaulay, a single shelf of good European library was worth the whole native literature of India and Arabia. Early in the morning, I find the campus is full of remarkable sights, like the statue of Ardhanarishwara, the god in male and female form. Nearby, behind a statue of goddess Saraswati, the goddess of learning, I find a much older Gothic monument just standing by itself in a park. But to me, the most affecting thing that I see in this amazing campus is the motto. Seen here by the swastika, it says Srutam Me Gopaya, translated to Let my learning be safe. I go looking for St. Mary's Church in Benares, the church at which Bishop Heber preached. We find it easily enough, but the doors are all locked. I can see the spire in the distance, but there's no way to get inside. My wonderful friends were completely befuddled by this inability to find a gate. We didn't give up though. We kept looking. After calling out for a while, eventually a wonderful man showed up who led us into the compound. He was accompanied by a large pack of friendly dogs. He had been clearing the churchyard, which is now full of dense vegetation, so I cannot visit any of the monuments that are said to be present here. This historic church, although looks very beautiful on the outside, is rapidly disintegrating and is in shambles inside. Queen Elizabeth is said to have visited here, but now it is essentially closed and stuck in litigation. Bishop Heber consecrated this church on September 5th, 1824 at exactly 7 p.m. He read the communion in Hindustani. A short distance from Old St. Mary's Church, crossing a bridge over Varuna River, I come to St. Mary's graveyard. This is the old British graveyard that Bishop Heber consecrated. Out here is the grave of a remarkable Greek, Demetrios Galanos, who lived in Benares when Bishop Heber visited. The bishop heard a great deal of him but did not meet him, and found it utterly mystifying that someone would just live here to study Hindu scriptures and translate them into Greek. This phenomenon of white folk coming to Benares to study Indian spirituality has become mainstream now, but Demetrios was a pioneer. Galanos lived in Benares for 40 years until his death in 1833. The locals held him in high esteem, calling him the Plato of this century. In stark contrast to Bishop Heber, who is now completely forgotten in India, the legacy of Galanos endures. He is remembered and even celebrated There is a Demetrios Galanos Chair for Hellenic Studies at Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi. Today, though, the cemetery is overgrown and inaccessible. I cannot even enter to find the grave of this remarkable man. A drive through the bucolic countryside of Uttar Pradesh brings me to the ancient fortress city of Chunar. This fortress is at least 2000 years old. This was the base of Sheshar Suri, who acquired it by marrying the widow of the governor at the time. Chunar was eventually acquired by the East India Company, who used it as a power base to quell Chet Singh's rebellion. Warren Hastings himself sought refuge in this fort. But before the fort, I go to see the British cemetery. The British have left these cemeteries all over India. In the words of Rudyard Kipling, they have marked this land with their dead. Chunar was one of the major stations for British invalids at the time, men who were injured or sickened in India and had no one to return to in England, or for some, no desire to return to England. Bishop Heber recognizes that this is the price to pay for an imperial power. He saw that some of the Europeans were very old. There was one who had fought with Clive, but many were young. In his words, the majority are men still hardly advanced beyond youth, early victims of a devouring climate, assisted perhaps by carelessness and intemperance. And it was a pitiable spectacle to see the white emaciated hands thrust out under a soldier's sleeve to receive the sacrament, and the pale cheeks and tall, languid figures of men who, if they had remained in Europe, would have been still overflowing with youthful vigor and vivacity, the best ploughmen, the strongest wrestlers, and the merriest dancers of the village. Situated on a high rock by a meandering bend of the Ganga, Chunar Fort has been strategically important for thousands of years. While he was here, Bishop Heber met a remarkable man, Trimbukji Dangle. Trimbukji was a Maratha, one of the flotsam and jetsam of the Anglo-Maratha wars that washed over the rest of India in the 1800s. After the Third Battle of Panipat, the Marathas were weakened but still a formidable power. With the unique confederacy structure, they were vulnerable to British tactics of divide and rule. The Second Anglo-Maratha War had weakened them further, and the British were looking to strike a hammer blow. That opportunity presented itself with the murder of Gangadhar Shastri. Gangadhar was an envoy sent by the British to mediate a dispute between the Gaikwad and Peshwa about payment of tribute. When the envoy, Gangadhar Shastri, was murdered in Pandharpur, Mount Stuart Elphinstone, the British governor of Bombay, was outraged by the killing of a Brahmin in a holy Hindu city. He blamed Trimbukji, the Peshwa's aide, for the murder and demanded the arrest of Trimbukji. Initially imprisoned in Thane, Trimbukji Dangle executed a daring escape in September 1816. Over the next few years, the British and the Marathas skirmished, but the Battle of Goregaon in January 1818 sealed the Peshwa's fate. The Peshwa was allowed to live the rest of his life in peace and pleasure near Kanpur, but the British harbored a grudge against Trimbukji, more out of fear than any sense of justice for Gangadhar Shastri's murder. They kept him imprisoned in Chunar until his death. Trimbukji Dangle was not the last high-profile prisoner held here by the British. Rani Jind Kaur, the widow of Ranjit Singh and the mother of Duleep Singh, was also held here, and she made a daring escape. She was never caught. There is a lot more to see at Chunar. Besides a wonderful view of the river, there are many pavilions which have an incredible amount of history associated with them, graceful windows, even some chhatris. Somewhere in this ancient fort, Bishop Heber was taken to the greatest curiosity of all, said to be the most holy place in all of India. I struggled to find this place. Bishop Heber describes this as marked by a rudely carved rose enclosed in a triangle. At this site, Hindus believed that god Shiva personally sits, although invisibly, for 9 hours every day, and the other 3 hours he went to Benaras. For this reason, it was believed that Chunar fort could never be taken by an enemy except between the hours of 6 and 9 in the morning. And for the same reason, because of the presence of the Almighty, this fort was free of danger of witchcraft. The royal family of Benaras had all their marriages celebrated at Sonwa Mandap. This small temple, with its carvings on the wall, now hidden by multiple pictures of gods and goddesses, is the closest that I can come to what looks like could have been the site of the holiest place in all of India. The priest simply seems to have no recollection of any such legend. There is one place in Chunar left for me to visit, and that is the Dargah of Qasim Suleimani. Bishop Heber likens the carvings on the gateway to the work of embroidery rather than the work of the chisel. This gateway was very familiar to British painters, from Thomas Daniel in 1797 to William Hodges a few years later. Today, this gateway is stunningly preserved in obscurity. The bishop visited many of the locations painted by Daniel and Hodges and Sitaram, and their paintings and books were the travelogues and the guidebooks of their time that Bishop Heber used to plan his own travels. Shah Qasim Suleiman was a revered saint who had found himself on the wrong side of the war between Khusro and Jahangir. He was imprisoned in Chunar after Jahangir won. There was likely some sort of rapprochement between Jahangir and the saint because Jahangir paid for this dargah and this gateway.